which we had already calculated by some method, has an alternate and possibly completely constant interpretation in terms of the set of new operators which we introduced, which I wrote yesterday as T, which is a time ordering operator, acting on phi at x2, phi dagger at x1, ground state expectation, where the operator phi of x has an expansion in terms of two more operators, which I want to denote as capital A of x plus b dagger of x. And these A and B has the further decomposition. A of x is given as an integral over the momentum shell. So this notation is that this is standing for d3p upon 2 pi the whole cube 1 upon 2 omega p. So this is the Lorentz invariant integration element in the momentum space. E to the minus ipx, these are the positive frequency modes. And your b of x is also made of positive frequency modes times the operator AP, which is an annihilation operator. And similarly, this is only difference is what are the annihilation and creation operators. So this is e to the APX, BP. So A and B look like this, but when you take B dagger and put it in here, this will sign will flip and you will get a B dagger. Now for every value of P, A and B are two annihilation operators. So you have twice infinity of harmonic oscillator operators acting on a given ground state. Okay. Corresponding to these, we have the creation operators, which are A dagger and B dagger, and they all obey the standard commutation rules. And A's and B's commute among each other. Oh, incidentally, there are two general comments. One is that there was a minor trip that I am overshooting time, but in order to compensate today, I will undershoot and we will stop at 1 hour or something. Somebody give me a cue when it is 1 hour. Second, you should feel free to stop me at any stage. Yesterday, one part of the derivation I was told was a little too fast, which I am going to redo. But you should completely feel free to just stop me and say that let's do this once again. Okay, then I will go through that. Okay, so this is the structure which we have. Then we actually showed that this quantity matches with this. Okay, that is where apparently I went a little fast. So I will do it in a different way. Instead of just repeating the derivation, I will do it in a different way. Okay, so let us first make sure what is going on here. If I look at that right hand side, this is x2, this is x1, this is left hand side of this quantity. So I have first theta of t2 minus t1, that is the time of this is greater than the time of this. Then the time of ordering operator doesn't do anything. Then I should have, I will just to save writing, I will just write it like this: phi at x2, phi dagger at x1. Then I have another term which is theta of t1 minus t2 with phi dagger at x1, phi at x2. Fine. So let us see what it involves. Both phi and phi dagger involve two of them. So when you multiply them out, in principle there are 4 quantities. So that is the part which I went through very rapidly, but let me do it a bit slowly. But you don't have to worry about Farad, only one and one will contribute. That is because when you have phi dagger acting on a vacuum state or the ground state of an oscillator, look at the structure of phi dagger. It has a B and an A dagger. B acting on the ground state will give you 0. Okay? So only A dagger can contribute there. So you are going to get here A dagger at x1. So I can even replace it by A dagger at x1. Now A dagger has created a A-type particle. So it's an particle state with a A-type particle. Now phi has to annihilate it in order to give you a non-zero transition amplitude with the ground state. So if I have got an A dagger here, the only A term in phi will contribute. Okay? So this is A at x2. Another way of thinking about this is A acting on to the left on the ground state is like A dagger acting to the right. So only the A dagger term will have an overlap. So this is one. And by a similar reasoning, when phi acts on the ground state, only B dagger will contribute, the annihilation operator will give you 0. So this can be replaced by B dagger, and this will be replaced by B. So one thing which you should immediately notice is that there is nothing funny happening as far as the A and B type particles are concerned. They propagate forward. Okay. So we have to keep working through this in order to understand where that backward propagation gets tackled in the field theory. This is the first step. When T2 is greater than T1, you always create a particle before destroying it. You need a particle to destroy it. That is the logic. Okay. So in that sense, quantum field theory conforms to common sense, very surprisingly. So you have here, you first create a particle, then you destroy it. But suppose T1 was greater than T2, no problem. You again create a particle and then destroy it. Because this is T2 is where you are doing the creation. And that is very cleverly taken care of by having a plus B dagger in your phi. Just A or just B would not have achieved this. The only difference is the particle you are creating here is different from the particle you are creating here, and this is the antiparticle of this one. Suppose we think of A particle as the particle, then the B is the antiparticle. So in one case it is a particle and the other case it is antiparticle, but in both the cases you first create before you destroy. Okay, fine. Let us go a bit further. We originally had an expression for x2, right? And what was that expression? That also had something like theta of T2 minus T1. Okay? And we wrote it down as the original expression we wrote as e to the minus I omega modulus of t. Then we said it is a e to the minus I omega t plus e to the igx, which is the positive frequency modes, which is precisely what you are going to pick up from this. Okay? Our original expression was this integral over t omega p e to the minus ip x where x stands for, of course, x2 minus x1. Then we had an expression for the other parametric, which was t1 minus t2 integral over d omega p e to the plus ip x2 minus x1. What is going to happen here? Let us take this A dagger at x1 acting on the value. That will give you e to the plus ip x1. Correct? E to the plus ip x1 is exactly what we have here. The other one will give you e to the minus ip x2. What about this? Here we have a B dagger at x2. So I will have plus, because it is B dagger, and x2. So you should have e to the plus ip x2, which is exactly what you have got. Okay, so everything matches. So the two terms which we originally had, we interpreted like this. Okay, fine. But now we want to explore this a little bit more closely. The second line, which we had derived at our class 1 or whatever. Okay, what does it tell you? what kind of amplitude does it give you in space time? So let us try to draw a space time diagram. So I will, instead of x2 and x1, I will take one of them to be a origin. So this is t, this is x, and we will use our old notation that t2 minus x1, t2 minus t1 and x2 minus x1 are denoted by t and x. So we start from the origin. Let us draw this line first. Okay. And we want to study the amplitude to go from here to here. If you really want, you could have shifted the coordinates and called this x1 and called this x2. Doesn't matter. Just to get the amplitude. So this amplitude. Okay. First thing is the amplitude to go from here to here is the same as the amplitude to go from here to here. Wherever x1 and x2 is. That is because in the Sugar representation it is obvious. It is an integral over some expression which has x minus y the whole square. So x to y flip doesn't change anything. So that is not an issue. Then let us say that you are within the line cone. Okay. We argue that this x1, x2 to x1 has an explicit algebraic expression which makes it manifestly Lorentz invariant. Okay. Therefore, whatever you get on the right hand side should be Lorentz invariant. So if you look at this, you will find that this is manifestly Lorentz invariant. This is a Lorentz invariant element and this is 4 vector product. So is this. But what about the thetas? It's pretty sad. You guys should have asked this question. None of you pointed this out. So I was wondering whether someone will raise it, but let me answer it since it was not asked. If t was within the light cone, theta of t is Lorentz invariant. I mean, theta of t tells you a time ordering. Now, if I take any point within the light cone, here or here, okay, then it is a Lorentz invariant object. Because if I say T2 is greater than T1 for some two events which are inside the light cone, you make any kind of Lorentz transformation, the T2 prime will turn out to be greater than T1 prime. So it has a Lorentz invariant meaning that something occurred after something else. T2 occurred later than T1. It has a Lorentz invariant meaning if it is within the light cone. Therefore, if I take any two events like this, I can ask for the two amplitudes. The first amplitude is to go from here to here. Okay? So, my second point is later than the first point. I will pick up this. This is not going to contribute. Okay? I could have also asked for this amplitude, say this one. So I am going from here to another point which is at an earlier time. So I am going backward in time. Then I would have picked up this. Okay, I am going back to our original derivation. We are not talking about fields now. I mean, we had an expression for this. I am just explaining that expression. I would have picked this. And no one would have quarreled with you because all other Lorentz observers would have said that if T1 is greater than T2, then even in there, even T1 is greater than T2, and they would have got this number. This number is a Lorentz invariant scalar. If this was 17 in one prime, it is 17 in all other prime. So everything would have been fine. But what if I am looking at propagation between an event here and an event here? This is x1 and this is my x2. Now you are in trouble. One observer will say that this x2 is greater than x1, that is the t2 for this is greater than t1, and he will pick this up as the amplitude. You make a Lorentz transformation. Another observer will say my x2 has gone below this because there could be another Lorentz prime in which x2 could have come here. And you say x1 is greater than x2, that is t1 is greater than t2. So I will pick this up. Right? So what happened to the Lorentz invariant? Well, the only way you could have saved is if this is equal to this outside the light cone. But of course, if it is identically equal to this everywhere, then I would have taken this out as a common factor and I would have got only this. So it's a very strange beast. These two things differ from each other inside the light cone and they are equal to each other outside the light cone. Okay? So this is remarkable, but it needs to be proved. Once I have told you all this, those of you who are alert would have seen the proof in a flash. I mean, there is no need to prove anything. The fact that these two are equal outside the light cone is very trivial, because once it is outside the light cone, I can always choose my coordinates such that t is equal to t2 minus t1 is 0. Just as I can go from here, I could have evaluated. When t2 minus t1 is equal to 0, we know that these two are the same, because they differ only by e to the minus I omega modulus of t. When t is equal to 0, they are same. Of course, when you do it like this, you will find that this one, when t is equal to t2 minus t1 is put to 0, you will pick up a plus p dot x2 minus x1. Here you will get a minus p dot x2 minus, but it's just p2 minus p flip changes nothing. It's a dummy variable and it will be zero. Therefore, remember that this quantity is going to play a very crucial role. These two objects entirely equal to each other outside the light cone, but they are not identically equal to each other. They differ inside. Okay. Now we will use this with some devilish cunning in combining it in this form in order to maintain causality. So this is a non-trivial result. Okay. So this is what you have. Okay. Now let us go a bit further. What about these issues like non-relativistic limit? Let me just settle that for a minute. In a non-relativistic limit, we know that we can pick either one of them, and by choice we pick this. And then you have this e to the minus I mc square pulled out of that, and the e to the plus 2 mc square t, I 2 mc square t in the other, so that gets suppressed by oscillation. So in a non-relativistic limit, you could have worked entirely with A, for example. This AP and this A in particular, in the non-relativistic limit, we will just go over to something like a Schrodinger wave function. More precisely, it is a Schrodinger wave function multiplied by some creation operator or an annihilation operator. This is what people call second quantized Schrodinger equations. But I had already told you that the second quantized, I personally think, is the wrong name convention. You don't quantize anything second time, once is bad enough. And what is done is you change the basis representation to a number basis. Okay? But that is not very relevant, but everything will take care of itself when you take the number basis. The next thing I want to do is to look at the kind of states involved in the right hand side of that. Let us get that also out of here. Yes.
So could you please explain the non-relativistic?
Okay. So we did the non-relativistic limit at the level of kernel earlier on. We started with this expression and we asked what happens when C goes to infinity. What we found was, by convention you can retain one out of the two, and it is nicer to retain this. When you retain this term, this expression on the exponential is omega t minus p dot x. Omega is square root of p square plus m square. When you take the non-relativistic limit, that will become p square by 2m and an mc square t. You can't do anything about mc square t. That will live with you, and you just say that it is a phase which we don't care. Okay, so you just take it as a phase convention in going from in the relativistic limit to the non-relativistic limit. In the other term, you had e to the minus I mc square t here. You will have e to the plus I mc square t here. When you pull out e to the minus I mc square t, you will get a e to the plus 2I mc square t. And you say that when C goes to infinity, that phase oscillates with infinite rapidity. Therefore, that is subdominant to this. Okay, this is what we did earlier on. This is not new. But what I am trying to say is that by the same translation, just A gets picked out here. The antiparticle just go away. I mean, I haven't rigorously introduced what is an antiparticle, but you think of the A-type particles as particles and B-type particles as antiparticles. And the B-type particles just go away, and you only have particles in quantum mechanics. This is the main difference between second quantized quantum mechanics and quantum theory. Combining the principles of special relativity with quantum theory demands the existence of antiparticles. This was one of the most beautiful results which came from quantum theory, that to every particle there is an antiparticle. In non-relativistic quantum mechanics, if you do second quantization, you can still work with variable number of particles. So there are several textbooks which sort of muddles this up. The fact that you are working with variable number of particles and you can create particles and destroy particles like phonons or whatever does not mean this sort of conceptually same as quantum field theory, because there is no such thing as an antiparticle in non-relativistic quantum mechanics in the C going to infinity. Okay? So this is the main difference. Now let us go back to the states here. What is our prescription? Left hand side prescription is very clear. Take the path integral for the relativistic particle, sum over all the paths from x1 to x2. That gives you that. What is the prescription on the right hand side? Compared to that, the right hand side prescription is more complicated. It says, start with the field phi of x, for which we even wrote down a Lagrangian. Decompose it into harmonic oscillators. So you have infinite number of harmonic oscillators of two kinds, the A type and the B type. Now do the quantum theory, quantum mechanics of the harmonic oscillator. What will that get you? For every harmonic oscillator, suppose you have a simple harmonic oscillator, then the states of that is described by an integer. Right? So if I have several harmonic oscillators, energy eigenstate of that will be described by say n1, n2, whatever number of oscillators you have. In this particular case, we have decided to label the oscillators by a vector. So there is a nk1, nk2, etc. Except for mathematical issues like it being a continuum, infinity, etc. Logically, there is nothing which is going wrong. In fact, you can discretize this by putting it in your box. You will still have infinite number of them, but it will be a discrete infinity. 2 pi over L times and an integer nx, ny, nz is what you have. So, for every one of them, you associate an integer. What it tells you is that if you tell me the 17th oscillator, it could be in the 38th eigenstate of the, it will be have a Hermite polynomial of order 38 describing it. Okay? That is for the 17th oscillator. Then you can take the 24th oscillator, put it at 108th excited. So you have a set of integers which describe the entire Hilbert space of these systems. In particular, all the integers going to 0 is what we have called the ground state. Okay, then the ground state of infinite number of oscillators. Now, when any of these things act on it, it takes it to the first excited state. It is the first excited state about the ground. Okay, what is this state? Because after all of this propagator, etc., is with some creation operator acting on that ground state that is going to take it to the first excited state. How do I describe this first excited state? Okay. Now I will give you this sort of intuitive justification for that. If you take it very, very seriously, you will run into trouble. Okay. But at some intuitive level, it is okay. First of all, the first excited state and the ground state differ in energy by Ek, which is h cross omega. Okay, this we know because we are dealing with oscillator. The energy level difference is h cross omega. So this h cross omega can be written as h cross square root of k square plus m square. So when the A dagger acts on the ground state of the oscillator, it produces a state which has this energy. Okay? Can I think of it as a particle? Well, if you think of it as a particle, then everything is consistent. That is clear. Because these, if these are my basis states, even if you switch on interactions among them, all that is going to happen is transitions between various states. So if you take a particular state, K2 equals 17, okay, the 17th oscillator, and you start with an n which is 13 and you went to 14, you can say that a particle has been created, one particle has been created with an energy corresponding to that, and it has been picked up, or a particle has been absorbed. So you can do that sort of thing. So the fact that this is an energy and that this is the energy you attribute to a particle, and this state has nk1 particles with labeled by k1, nk2 particles labeled by k2, etc., seems to be completely consistent. The next thing you want to do is to give a meaning to k. Now, the zeroth level way of giving the meaning to k is to just say that look at this expression. This expression is sort of calling out for an interpretation that k is the momentum, because p square plus m square is this is a relativity of particles, so it's that is fine, but there is a slightly different way of giving the meaning to this momentum, which is useful in different contexts. So let me just introduce that. This uses the fact that the momentum operator is in some sense, not in some sense, in some rigorous sense, it acts as a translation generator in space. Okay? So I want to introduce this. The main reason being I want to dehydrate. What is involved in this is something called Taylor series expansion of function in ordinary calculus. There is nothing more than that. But the way it is introduced using group theory and things like that can mystify it. So I want to do a little bit of demystification of that. Then we will come back to it. Okay. So let us consider the following. It works for any number of variables. So let us just work with a 4-dimensional set. Consider a function f of x. Complex function where x is again a 4-dimensional notation defined by this. This is some state and it projects this as x. You can even, in fact, you have 1 dimension, it doesn't make any difference. Now, suppose I want to look at f at x plus a. Now, we know that this is given by summation over n, a to the n upon n factorial. Nth derivative with respect to x acting on f of x. There is no approximation because I am retaining all the terms. Okay, this is a rigorously valid procedure. This I can write as exponential a del. So let me denote some notation. ai. Okay, I is a bad notation. AK dk acting on f. This is an operator, AK dk operator, exponential of that, defined by the power series. So if I take that power series and plug it in, I am just using the fact that x to the n upon n factorial is exponential. Okay? So what does this give you in actual expansion? Let us look at that. It is going to stand for something like a0 d by dt. Okay, and with our convention, it is minus a dot del. This is what is sitting in the exponential. What we want to do is to write it in a slightly different way. I want to put an I here. And I want to put a minus I here so that I haven't changed anything. Then here I want to put a minus I and I put an I here. Again I haven't changed anything. Therefore this is equal to minus I a naught. I d by dt is what you would have called the Hamiltonian operator. Here I have minus. Okay, let me just make sure that there seems to be some sign problem. Okay, minus I a dot del. Okay, rather let me write this as minus I del is the momentum operator P. Okay, what I want to check is I have changed this. Sorry, this should be plus. Yes. Plus Ik P dot. Okay, because we had already taken care of that while writing it in this form. Okay. So this is what you have, and this is just the one quantity corresponding to Hamiltonian, which involves the translation in D, because the x0 goes by a0 and the vector x goes by x plus a. Okay, so the whole thing can be written as this expression is equal to exponential minus I a dot p, where the momentum p is just this 4-dimensional analog of this. That is P J, if I look at it, that should have I d by dt and a minus sign there. Fine. The minus sign comes because I have lowered dt. If I had raised it up, it would have been I. So this is what we have. And using this, I can say what these things do to the states. Because let us go back to this. This is acting on f of x. As I always say, the signs etc. is your business to fix. So let us look at this. And let us look at this. This is x plus a psi is going to be e to the minus iap acting on f of x, which is x psi. Now you quietly remove this I and you invert it so that it looks nicer. So you have x plus a equals e to the iap x. This is the way it is usually quoted in the textbooks, assuming the signs are right and our sign conventions are right. So if you take a state, this operator acting on it will shift it to a state which is with a label x replaced by x plus a. Now you can put it to a good use in several contexts to argue like this. Suppose you have a state which, when you translate x to x plus a, picks up a phase which is e to the ia mu, then mu is the momentum of the state. Okay? Because if it had a momentum mu, then e to the iap acting on that would have picked up e to the ia mu. So the converse is that if you know the state has this property that under translation it does this, then it should have this moment. That is obvious here, because if you take for example the A dagger acting on the vacuum state. So let us look at this. A dagger of x acting on your ground state is going to give you integral over d omega p e to the, because of A dagger, I to the px times an on particle state when AP acts on the ground state. Now, if you think of this as a sum over different states, any one of them is given by this. This 1p comes with the e to the ipx label. If I now change x to x plus a, this is going to pick up a e to the ip. Therefore, it makes sense to think of this as a state which has a momentum p. This is a slightly more rigorous derivation than just reading out the momentum from that. Now, I need to do all these circles because we are having a bunch of harmonic oscillators and trying to interpret this as particles. Okay? I mean, you never do this in quantum mechanics, right? I mean, this is nothing but quantum mechanics at some level. But here we want to bring in Lorentz invariance everywhere. Lorentz invariance is hidden in this. The Lorentz invariance everywhere, in order to argue that I can consistently think of this system as a system made of particles, and these particles come with their own momentum and energy. Energy is easy because the two energy levels differ by h cross omega. But the momentum is a little non-trivial, but that you can think of from this. Okay. So this is fine. We have got up to this stage. Now the next thing which we want to do is to ask, okay, what does this amplitude really mean? Okay. I mean, we had originally a propagator. Now we have got it in terms of the fields. And in terms of the fields, what does it mean? To do that, I want to introduce just one more concept, but that concept will become much clearer when we do electrodynamics. Because without electrodynamics, charged particles and uncharged particles have no difference. And only when you couple it to an electromagnetic field, charges play a role. So this scalar field which I have introduced here, it will turn out actually represents charged particles. Okay? And in particular, the charge of the particle which are created and annihilated by the A operator is opposite of the charge in the particle produced and created by B operator. So let us say A operator has a charge plus Q, B operator has a charge minus Q. Now I want to ask for a process in space time represented by the following. I don't need this anymore. Okay, let us consider two events. This is x1, this is x2. I'm not really worried about the time orientations, but just think of it in some frame, this is the orientation. Okay? I'm not saying this is inside the light mode, so the orientation could depend on the Lorentz time. I don't care. I want to ask for a process which, let us say, increases the charge here by plus Q. Let me use it. Yeah. It increases the charge by Q here. And later on, decreases the charge by Q. Okay? How do I do that? Well, one way is to create a particle with a charge Q here, propagate it here, and destroy it. Okay? That would take care of it. But just think of the physical thing which I can measure is whether the charge has increased by Q or decreased by Q. So what do I need? I need to create a particle of charge Q here. So I need to have an operator A dagger of x1 acting at this event. That will create a charge of plus Q. Then I need an operator A of x2 acting here. Okay? And I can't destroy a particle before I have created a particle. Therefore, I need to do something like this A should come after this. That will. Now there is another way of doing the same thing. I can increase the charge by plus Q if I destroy a particle with a charge minus Q. So I would have done the same thing by doing here a B of x1. Okay, that would have destroyed the charge. It would have produced the same effect. Then I wanted to reduce the charge here by Q. That I could have done by using a B dagger at x2. Correct? Very good. That means I can achieve this process of adding a charge Q here and then decreasing a charge Q there later in two different ways. First, I could have said if x2 is greater than x1, that is theta of t2 minus t1. If this is the case, then I can create a particle here and then destroy it later. Therefore, I could have done A at x2, A dagger at x1. Okay? Could I have done it with B? No. Because B tells me that I have first destroy a particle. And my rule is I cannot destroy before I have created because I need a particle to destroy. So I can't use B. If x2 is greater than x1, this is all I can do. But if somebody else says that in my frame it is the other way around, I'll say don't worry about it. I can still give you a way to do this charge. But now I will start with a B dagger at x2. Then I will destroy it later at B at x1. Okay? Now if you tell me that, look, I don't care about how you do it, I want to increase the charge at x1 by q and decrease the charge at q2. What is the net amplitude? I'll say, okay, you are not telling me whether x2 is at a later time compared to the earlier time, and you will say, no, I can't tell you because they are space-like separated. Okay? So it depends on which observer you are asking. Then I say, okay, then I need to cover all my possibilities. So I will give you this sample. Okay, yeah. The last part. Okay. What is happening is that I want a guy to tell me this is the process. So I will say, okay, can you tell me whether T2 is greater than T1 or T2 is less than T1? If you can tell me that, then I can pick one of this or this. say no, I would have very much loved to tell you that, but it just so happens that x2 and x1 are space-like separated. Therefore, in my frame T2 is greater than T1, but there could be another observer in whose frame T2 can be less than T1. So if I tell you something, I will be lying. It will be a frame-dependent statement. Then I will say, okay, still there is no problem. What I will do is, I will say the total amplitude has two parts. Depending on which observer you are talking to, he will pick either this or this. But don't worry about it. The physically observed quantity of increasing the charge at some point and decreasing the charge at then, both the observer will agree. Yeah.
What about the conservation of charge you are creating somewhere?
No, but that is not an issue, right? I am creating it here and then destroying it here. See, there must be some other process which should have compensated for it. See, the whole process, when you look at it, you will look at processes like this. So there will be some creation and some destruction which will go on. I am just taking one piece of it. Okay, it has to be combined together in a consistent way. You don't want charge conservation to be valid. In fact, okay, I haven't done this yet, but when we do that, we will see how that is taken care of. Okay. So, the reason I am spending time is that these things are not described in books, explained clearly in books. But this is what field theory is all about. I mean, this is why you need it. And after that, you can compute your Feynman diagrams or scattering cross sections and all that. That is just manipulation. The reason field theory works is that I need to cover my back on processes on space-like intervals where something like this can happen. When that is happening, I need both these terms here. But what is this? This is exactly what we have written on here. The crucial point is, in both the cases, daggers are to the right of non-daggers, because you have to create before you can destroy. But the events in which it is happening will be correlated with the time order. If T1 is less than T2, x1 will come on the right. If T2 is less than T1, x2 will come on the right. And the entire expression can be written at one stroke like this. That is because we combine both and P dagger into phi. Either with just A or either with just B, we cannot achieve this. Okay. So you particles and antiparticles sort of gel together as a single entity in quantum field theory. Thinking of them as separate is just a matter of convenience. The mathematics requires both of them. This is why I told you yesterday when someone raised the question, don't think of phi as particles and phi dagger as antiparticle. That is not correct. Phi itself has a particle part and an antiparticle part, and phi dagger also has that, and only that linear combination makes it. Now we can go further. Once you have got this elementary process,
What is this charge? I didn't get exactly.
Okay, that is for very good reason, because I didn't explain it. I am just saying, for the moment you just assume that A has an electric charge plus Q and B has an electric charge minus Q. I haven't proved it. But one way of thinking about this is, if phi gets replaced by e to the I alpha, if I change the phase by e to the I alpha, phi dagger will get changed by e to the minus I alpha. And the phase and the conservation laws associated with this phase is what is going to eventually give electromagnetic coupling. And until I have introduced electromagnetic coupling, I cannot logically talk about charge. Okay? So right now you just assume that the A's and B's has one more attribute, which I call electric charge, which is equal and opposite. Okay, fine. Right. So you have got up to this. Now let us look at another process, which also might come as a little bit of a surprise if you have been thinking about it differently. Okay, let us think of this process. In piecemeal fashion, if you really want it, you need not connect these things up and think of it as three. I mean, these are just events which we want. Okay, so you say that there is a particle which is going from, say, x1 to x2, then x2 to x3, and x3 to x4. Okay, we are particularly interested in this part of it. Now, in this part of it, what you are going to have is an x2, t2 which is greater than t3. If t2 is greater than t3, that is the end point, if it is backward propagation. Okay, that is what we mean. I mean, when you have written down x2 to x1, you can ask, there is a t2 level here, t1 level here, which is greater. If you are saying it is going from T1 to T2 where T2 is already in the past, it's a backward propagation. The backward propagation involves B. Okay? So this part of it is going to be arising from that B, which is our antiparticle. Fine. But the antiparticle will not go like this. It will go like this. Because the principle again, you have to create before you can destroy. Okay? So the X2, it gets created and then it gets destroyed at X1. So this immediately translates what I told you in the very first lecture, that when you have paths propagating like this, the left-hand side of X2, X1 obtained by the path integral, they took into account amplitudes for these processes. The right-hand side does not care about all the funny propagations, but it deals with variable number of particles. So it will tell you that there is a process in which at this point I created not only a B-type particle but also an A-type particle. I mean the maths will take care of it. The A-type particle went there, the B-type particle went here. Okay. So the fact that it was created here and destroyed here later is tuned in by the time ordering operator where you flip. The creation happens here and then destruction happens. Now if I take this line, that comes back to our charge conservation. Originally here I had a just plus Q charge. Here also I have only plus Q charge. Because I have one particle flowing around with a minus Q, one with plus Q and one plus Q. So at every space-like hypersurface, charge will be conserved. And in fact that tells you that the antiparticle should have precisely the same charge as the particle. That the antiparticle has the same mass as the particle is trivial in our approach, because both of them are the same harmonic oscillator omega p with the same parameter m thrown in. We took p square plus m square and kept the same mass for both. The fact that they should have the same charge comes much later in electrodynamics, but this conservation law sort of tells you this. Now, what might be surprising to you is that you might have thought that all these outside light cone propagation, etc., is actually relevant when things are in space-like intervals. So you might have thought that if these two things are in space-like separated intervals, then that is when you need to sort of twiddle your thumb and come up with an interpretation. Actually, it turns out to be the other way around. That is because suppose these two are space-like separated, right? They are outside each other's light cone. Then you just say, look, I don't want to be bothered by this, go to a Lorentz frame where this is about this. Then you only have to deal with forward propagation all along. That's a little surprise, but in principle, then somebody can be pig-headed and say, you explain to me in the frame in which it is going back. Then we have to do this. But if he doesn't insist in that, there is always a Lorentz frame in which space-like separated trajectories which are going backward in time can be thought of as forward in time and something else. So if you are only working with those trajectories, surprising though it might seem, you can actually do away with this extra business and deal with this. Okay? The real killer is when it is inside the light cone and going backward. So if you have a trajectory like this, okay, which is well within the light cone here, and it decides to go backwards, then there is no way you can say that this event is above that in some other frame. You better understand how that backward propagation works and that will come. Okay? So this backward propagation of a particle in the path integral kind of an approach would be thought of as the forward propagation of an antiparticle at this point. Okay, fine. Now comes probably the most important aspect of them all, the question of causality. So we said this is a nice description which takes everything into account and usually A and B and things like that. Now, why do I want to use this? And there are several reasons. When you throw in interactions, etc., physical descriptions look nicer, and there are all kinds of arguments can be given. But there is one primary argument. Namely that if you look at that propagator, originally we said that if a particle is created here and you want to know what is the amplitude for the particle to be here, that is nonsense. And I said this is no amount of advanced quantum field theory will make this result go away. If you put a particle here and you look for a particle there, you will find it with a low probability. The reason is because you cannot localize the particle. I mean, the statement that I put a particle here is not well defined, because when you try to localize it, particle and antiparticles will be produced all over the place and you will catch it with a low amplitude. Okay? But we wanted a causal description of the whole thing. So in some sense, you must have something else which I can measure on a space-like hypersurface without disturbing each other. So the whole idea is that if I make a measurement at one point and the t is equal to constant surface, I should be able to give an initial value data for these things, fields or whatever you call it, and everything should work out fine. So that has to do with what is the commutation relation between these operators which we have introduced on a t equals constant surface. But we will work it out in general and come back to it. Okay? First thing, let us look at the commutation of A operator. Now, A of x of course commutes with A of y. That's a non-trivial statement. It is not that A commutes with A. A at x is one operator, A at y is another operator, because both are annihilation operators. Therefore, A of x commutes with A of y. No problem. Similarly, B of x commutes with B of y. Same argument. A of x also commutes with B of y, because your APs and BPs commute. So fine. So the only place where we are going to run into trouble is when you want to compute A commutator, A dagger at 1. Okay, so let us open this up. This is going to be, okay, this is one place where if I miss a minus sign, I am sunk. So you should watch like chalk and make sure I don't do this. So this is d omega p. Then an integral d omega q. I have A and an A dagger commutator which I need. So there is going to be a product. Let us associate with P, the x variable. So A at x is e to the minus ipx AP. Okay. With B we are going to associate with the point y. We want to associate a dagger, so it is plus e to the plus I k y. Hopefully this is correct. So then this is AP commutator A. Let us make sure this is correct. There is a e to the minus ipx AP. E to the minus ipx AP will give me A of x. Then e to the plus iky ak. E to the plus iky ak will give me A dagger at y. Okay?
A dagger.
Sorry. Good. Okay, A dagger at y. So this quantity we know what it is. This is a nice Lorentz invariant commutator. So this is going to give me 2 pi to the power 3 2 omega either k or p Dirac delta function on k minus p. Okay? This is nice. In d omega k there is 1 2 pi cube which will go away, 1 2 omega factor will go away. So all that can be cancelled and an integration can be performed on that. So k is set to y. So I get e to the minus, k is set to y, so it is e to the minus ip x minus 1. This is of course our old friend, which we have got here. And it better be, when you take a vacuum expectation value in a commutator, only one of them will contribute, so it should match it. So that is fine. If you do B dagger, you get the same thing. That is obvious because the commutation relations doesn't care whether you are talking about A type particle or B type particle. So this is B of x, B dagger. So how does it look at equal times? So what we are going to look at is A at some time t at some coordinate x, commutator A dagger at some time same time t commutator. If you do that, I am just going to put the time difference to be 0 there. So I will get integral d3p over 2 pi d whole cube 1 upon 2 omega p e to the I p dot x minus 1. As usual, this is not a Dirac-Delta solution because of your 2 omega. In a kind of a non-relativistic limit, it would have become Dirac-Delta function. Here it is not a Dirac-Delta function, so this does not vanish. What does that mean? That means that if you think of A of x as some kind of a field, it's a complex field. If you think in terms of C numbers, and it becomes non-Hermitian in the quantum theory because this is not the Hermitian conjugate of itself. Therefore, if you want to give the initial data for the field, you want to give a complete description to the field at a given time, you have to specify both A and A data. Okay? But A and A data do not commute. So I cannot simultaneously give its value at two different points. Because remember, just as in quantum mechanics, you want to give Q and Q dot in order to evolve things forward. If you want to work with the field, you want to give the field everywhere. We will come back to the issue of what happens to the time derivative of the field, but at least you should be able to specify the field everywhere, which you can. Tells you that if you measure the A field at some point, it will disturb at a space like this. So we don't like this. We don't want this to happen. Outside the light zone, no such effect should propagate. If I go and measure something here, its measurements effect can only propagate within the light zone. And measurements are essentially going to be quadratic objects on phi and phi dagger with either an operator or some C number in between. That is what will happen in field theory. So those things better commute outside the light zone. So this does it. Okay. Let us look at our phi. If phi also doesn't commute, the course ends here because field theory doesn't work. Okay. But let us see what happens to phi. We will find that phi behaves much better. So in order to do that, I want to compute the same, okay, again the same thing. Let us look at phi at x, phi at y. If I look at phi at x, phi at y, what kind of commutators will come in? You are going to have a commutator between A at x and A at y, vanishes. B dagger at x and a B dagger at y, vanishes because B commutators vanish, daggers will also vanish. A commutator with B cross products vanish, they don't talk to each other. Right? So phi at x commutator, phi at y will vanish for a complex scalar field. But of course, when you go to a real scalar field, the phi at y is, we don't know whether you are talking about phi or phi dagger. So there is a little bit of an issue there. In the sense that you have to be careful. But we are talking about a non-Hermitian complex scalar field, and there phi at x and phi at y commute. That's why there are 2 degrees of freedom hanging around. Fine. So the again only non-trivial thing I need to compute is phi at x commutator, phi dagger at y. So this is going to be A at x plus B dagger at x. This is the definition of phi. Commutator A dagger at y plus B at y. What is this? Okay, you first have A at x, commutator A dagger at y, plus A commutes with B, so I don't care about that. Then this B dagger commutes with A dagger, I don't care about that. So I am left with B dagger at x, commutator B at y. But I would like to write it in a reverse order. So I will put this as minus B at y, B dagger at x. This is exactly the same as this, but with x and y reversed. Okay? So what is this quantity? This quantity is going to be integral d omega p. We know this quantity already. e to the minus ip x minus y minus e to the minus ip y minus x. So this is plus x minus y. Very nice. This is what we saw before. We said that there is this quantity which is sitting here and there is this quantity sitting here. These two differ by just x2, x1 going to x1, x2. Right? Now this we know vanishes outside the line. So what is it more explicitly? More explicitly, this is going to be integral d3p upon 2 pi the whole cube 1 upon 2 omega p. I don't care about the spatial part, e to the I p dot x minus y. Because in the second one, by flipping the sign of p, I could have made it the same. Because the way it is written, it will have a negative sign for this, but that I can take care. But I can't do anything with the time part. So I will have e to the minus I omega p. This is t, which is, let's say, x minus y, or rather I will write it as x naught minus y naught explicitly minus e to the I omega p x naught by t. Now it is obvious that when I take x naught equals y naught, that is when I go to the equal time commutator. So this implies that phi at t comma x, phi at t comma y is because when x naught is equal to y naught, this is 1, it cancels out.
Dagger. Phi dagger.
Sorry, right. Okay. Therefore, as far as phi's are concerned, you are fine. And you needed this clear cancellation between these two. What I essentially showed you earlier is that this commutator and this commutator, which got translated into the two coefficients of the theta functions, they are the same outside the line code. Why were they the same outside the line code? Because if they were not the same outside the line code, you run into trouble with Lorentz invariance. Because Lorentz invariant tells you that outside the line code, these events can be T2 greater than T1 in one prime, T2 less than or in another prime. One guy will pick this, another guy will pick this, and they better get the same answer, therefore they have to be the same. Because they are the same, if you pick these two guys out and combine them to form this field phi, rather than work with either A or B, you take this A plus beta combination, then when you compute this commutator, there is a nice cancellation between these two and it vanishes. They don't vanish everywhere. If they vanish everywhere, again the field theory would have become trivial. They don't vanish inside the line code because you can check this out. Up to this point it is fine. Okay? If these two, suppose you take two events which are along the vertical axis, then you can't hold this argument because the reversal works in vector p but not in omega p. When you change p to minus p, omega p doesn't change. So as a result of it, this kind of jugglery will not work in the other case. So it is non-zero inside the light cone, but it vanishes outside the light cone. So these are very good quantum operators because on a given space-like hypersurface at t is equal to constant, I can specify the value of phi and a phi dagger. I cannot, and we anyway know that phi commutes everywhere, so that doesn't matter. Okay. Okay, the one point which I wanted to make, which is not very relevant, that suppose you have been working with a real scalar field, then the A's and B's would have been identified. It would have been A plus A dagger. Then when you go and compute phi at x at phi at y, here I argued saying that when I take phi at x at phi at y, the A commutes with A at x commutator and you have a at y, then you had a b and this, and then A and b dagger commutes. The statement A and B Dagger commutes assumes A is not B. Okay? If A turns out to be B, then A and A Dagger will again give you some kind of a non-trivial commutator. So when you are dealing with a real scalar field, you have to take into account the fact that your B is identified with A. And in this expression, if it is a real scalar field, I could have thought of this phi dagger as phi, and what I have got will remain true. But our original statement that phi x and phi y commutes because of this argument will not go through when A is equal to 2. Okay? So that is just a minor clarification on this. So this is the way you build field theory, and this argument again tells you that the contribution from particles to the commutator nicely cancels with the contribution from the anti-particles outside the line. Okay. So what has that to do with causality? The following, that we will see when we do field theory. Roughly speaking, the observable quantities in the field theory at any given point will have a structure which is like phi at that point, some d, phi dagger at that point. These are the local observables. Where this d can be just a function, or it could be an operator which is local operator, differential operator acting on this, or it could be phi dagger here and phi here, that doesn't matter. So they will be bilinears. So I am going to throw it in as an exercise one of these days for you to show that if phi and phi dagger commutes on t is equal to constant surface, all such creatures commute. So if you build an observable and you take O at x and O at y and you look at the commutator, when x and y are space-like separated, they commute. So you make a measurement of an observable in the field theory, it will not disturb the measurement of another observable on a space-like separation. Now why is it important? It is important for the following reason. Suppose I made a measurement of some observables, and you find that because of that measurement, what you do with that observable got affected. Logic requires that your observation should have come after my observation. Okay? Now that is a very rigorously Lorentz invariant statement only if we two are separated by a time-like interval. So for time-like separations, if I do something and it screws up your observation, fine. I mean that is the way physics proceeds. But if we are space-like separated, then in one frame I can say that yeah, I did something and your time was later than mine and it got affected. But another Lorentz observer will say no. That person found that your measurement has affected his observation even before you made the observation. Okay, this is not allowed. So here is where causality is built in. Your effect should come after the cause, and effect should come after the cause in all Lorentz frames. This all Lorentz frame is fine within the light cone. So outside the light cone, you better make sure that nothing happens. So this statement is equivalent to the thing which you normally say in probability that nothing travels faster than light. I mean, that is a loose statement. You usually say no observable effects can go from one event to another event which are space-like separated. Okay? And the reason we say this is you want the effect to come after the cause, and that statement is not well defined for space-like separation. So you leave it. So we have demonstrated its consistency. So this in some sense tells you how to translate everything which we had in terms of the propagator to a description in terms of a set of operators defined at every event. I mean, for the lack of better name, we call it a field. But I did not start from a classical field and context. Okay? I started with a classical relativistic particle, found its quantum propagator, found that the same quantum propagator occurs in a completely different context involving infinite number of oscillators, and I constructed the operators for that. Then I found, lo and behold, those operators have nicer features which I originally did not have, like causality. Okay? Therefore, I will stick with these. Now you can say, okay, maybe it's a better way is not to do any of this. and start with this field and quantize it. Okay, that is what the conventional textbooks do, and this is the motivation for that, and which we will do. But before that, the next week I wanted to do something else. All throughout we have been talking somewhat loosely about creating a particle and destroying a particle. Okay, of course we have an A and A dagger which does that, but that is not like a physical source and a sink. Okay. Now, if I know how to create a particle and destroy a particle, if I am clever, I mean as clever as Schwinger, then you should be able to figure out how it propagates in between. And this is what Schwinger did, and he has an entire procedure for looking at field theory in what is known as source theory, where what is essentially done is you latch on to the creation and destruction, and if you do everything in a Lorentz invariant way, maintaining unitarity and all that, in between part is so constrained that you can read it out. So it is so beautiful that I want to spend some time working that out. That will give a completely different alternate route to the fields. I mean, that of course Schwinger won't do because he doesn't want to field, but we can use that, the good parts of that, and then develop it in this line. And that will give you a much more conventional way of looking at the field theory at an advanced level. I mean, you won't start with free field theory, then add a source, etc., etc. Everything will come out at one go. So this is what we will start on from next week. So it's absolutely essential that you are familiar with all these material by then. So spend some time and read it. We will stop there today. Well, I still have gone to more than what I thought, but that's okay. Questions, comments?
Sir, could you explain the theta x?
What was it?
Theta x.
Theta x. Oh, okay. That is my calligraphic goal now, theta. But anyway, that doesn't matter. So what I said was, we have this phi h x and phi dagger x commuting. Okay? But you can also, what is the big deal? Okay, if you want to think of a field defined on a given hypersurface and propagating and all that, then that is a nice thing to do. But it has a greater impact and deeper motivation, and that motivation is the following. When we eventually do field theory, what we will be working with is this phi of x. Then you want to construct observables from phi of x. Think of phi of x, for example, like let us say the vector potential in electrodynamics. Okay, you can even think of it as an electric field if you want to. Then there are observable quantities like, for example, Poynting vector or energy density. They will be like E square and B square and things like E cross B. These are all bilinear combinations of the fields. So since you want the bilinear combinations to be Hermitian, and since phi is not Hermitian, you will have phi and phi dagger. So that combination is Hermitian. And you can act on it either with a differential operator without violating this, or you can put some function in between. So all the Hermitian operators, observables which we will be thinking of in field. See, phi itself is not Hermitian. So you don't want to associate an observable with phi. But the phi dagger combinations or the observables which you will get in field theory. So this is a sort of a prototype of an observable in field theory. What we need to show is that if I take such an observer at x and another observable like that at y, then O at x and O at y commutes when x and y are space-like separate. So this is a little harder than doing this, and therefore it will be an exercise. So you guys can work that out. Yeah. It's straightforward, it's just more tedious all the time. Yeah.
So we have that x1, x2, x3, x4 events and then
Right.
from x3 to x2 the antimatter is going.
Correct.
Are there any space-time constraints on the position of x3?
No. So the way it works is that I am trying to translate the paths from which we first evaluated this into this picture. Okay? So when you were doing paths, you were summing over all the paths. So there is no constraint on in between points. I mean, you take all the paths, some of the paths might go like this, and x1 can be here, x2 can be there, etc.
Once the particle in x1 has initiated, the event x1 has done.
Right. Okay.
There should be some passing of information.
Yeah, okay. So there are two ways of thinking about this. We found that there are even closed loops in space-time. which can be interpreted in terms of some half h cross omega. I haven't done it yet, but obviously once you have these oscillators and you have this state, I very cleverly talked about the first excited state and the difference in energy between first excited state and the ground state. What is the energy of the ground state? That is a big can of worms which we will come to, and that energy of the ground state is what comes into that closed loops. Okay, so I could have even thought of without initiating a particle, but the proper way to do this is to say that there is an amplitude for creating a particle at x1, there is an amplitude for destroying a particle at the final point, whatever it is, let us say x2. Then the total amplitude for creating a particle at this point and destroying it there is this amplitude multiplied by the propagator x1 to x2 times the other amplitude. Now this is what we are going to do in the next week. Okay, because the next most logical step, we will work out how the creation and destruction works. And when you write the expression for it almost by magic, you will pick out this x2 minus x1, this expression. This very complicated expression will fall out of it. And you don't have to do path integrals or anything. Any other question?
So this 5x,
Yeah.
it can be Hermitian in cases where there's not.
When A is equal to B, it is Hermitian.
Yes.
Right. So this is A plus beta here. Neither of them are by themselves.
In those cases, can it be an observable?
Can it be?
Can it be an observable?
Okay, this is a moot point. In principle, it can be observed. Okay. Now, what quantum mechanics actually tells you is that if you have an observable, there is a Hermitian operator associated. It is a little bit silent on whether every Hermitian operator is an observable or not. The standard interpretation of measurement theory, etc., in quantum mechanics tells you that if you have a Hermitian operator and you are clever enough, you can devise an experiment by which it can be observed. Okay, but that is fine. In that case, everything will go through in some sense, because in that case, if I take phi at x, phi at y commutator on space-like separation, that is when t is equal to constant or whatever, it will give you zero. And it will give you a Dirac function, because at a point it has to sort of give you a Dirac function when you take the canonical momentum and all that. But other than that, you will get it. But that in the reverse direction we will do. See, the way the course is being planned is that in the next couple of weeks or 1 week, I am going to do this, approaching this from the part of the sources. So the moment you have sources, there is a very nice way to do a functional Fourier transform to get this Lagrangian, and then I will also introduce functional techniques on the field theory. And there is a way of getting this result as a functional derivative of something analogous to partition function. All that we will do. Then we will switch and do the canonical field theory. That is, we will start from a field and derive all these things. At that time, some of these issues will get clarified. Yeah.
Okay, so x1, x2 is the propagator, but is it fine, say, if I just assume t2 is greater than t1,
Right.
so I just pick up one part, so phi dagger x1 acting on that 0, is it okay to interpret as a particle being created at x1, position x1 in the...
Yeah, let us do it after we have done this source and sink business. As I said, if you don't push it too hard, you won't run into trouble. But if you push it too hard, it can lead to trouble. See, the whole question is, when you are creating a particle, you don't know where it is going to end up. Now, the place where it is going to end up, if it is going to be space-like separated with this, then you are in trouble. Suppose you guarantee to me that I will only work within light cone. See, you started by saying, suppose T2 is greater than T1. That statement immediately assumes that these two events are time-like separated. If they are space-like separated, that statement you cannot make with confidence because it's a frame-dependent statement. So suppose we are going to stick only within the light cone. If you are going to stick only within the light cone, then we know that in these things, either on forward light cone or backward light cone, let us stick with forward light cone, then only this term is going to ever contribute. So you can always interpret it just in terms of these objects. And you can think of this as a non-particle created at x1 as you say, and then it goes to x2. You can do that. Okay? But that is not a sufficiently general statement because I want to cover space-like separated events. And there you do not know how to interpret this. I mean, this entire object, it involves two kinds of creations and annihilations going on simultaneously. So the whole question is about that. We saw this even at the very first lecture. E to the minus I omega modulus of t is your killer. The moment there is a modulus of t, you have to deal with positive t and negative t with a theta of t thrown in. The moment you have put in theta of t, you have to worry about what happens in space-like separation. And that is why you need to do all of this. Anything else? Okay.